This picture of London is about 300 years old. I wonder what you notice. Perhaps you notice how many churches there are, and perhaps you notice how many boats there are on the river. Well, there was a boy who was born in London about 300 years ago, and his whole family worked on the boats. And at 11 years old, unlike you, who kind of at school, he was put on a ship and the ship went off to sea, and he started life as a cabin boy, working on ships from the age of 11. He carried on working on ships for many, many years. Life on board ships could be extremely tough, and he ended up in the Royal Navy, where things were so tough that he eventually ran away. Another ship came alongside the ship that he was on, and he escaped onto that ship. What he didn't know was that the ship he was now on was a slave ship. It was going to Africa, and in Africa, the whole purpose of the trip was to buy slaves and take them to the Americas and sell them in America. He was about 18 years old at this time, and instead of his life getting better, it became worse. The ships were some of the most miserable places on earth. Not just miserable for the crew, although it was pretty miserable for them, but terrible for the people who'd been captured in Africa, put in chains, put into the cargo holds of these boats, which would then travel all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, a journey so terrible that many people didn't survive, only to be sold as slaves to work out the rest of their lives without any freedom, being treated like animals. The boy's name was John, and he continued working on slave ships for many, many years. But in the middle of a storm, one time he thought he was going to drown, and he prayed to God and asked for his life. And if God spared his life, that he would give it to God. Well, after the storm, John's heart started to change. He started to become more interested in reading the Bible and praying. And then when he got back to England, to Liverpool, going to church and studying the Bible. And in the end, he decided to leave the ships after many years and become a pastor. Lots of people really loved his preaching, and he wrote lots of Christian songs as well that people really enjoyed singing to God. But as he got older, he ended up pastoring in London, and he looked back at his life and he remembered the slaves and the slave ships and the terrible things that those people had to live with and the terrible things that he had done to them. And he felt so guilty, so bad about what he'd done. He felt it wasn't enough just to say sorry to God and find forgiveness. He needed to make a change and a difference to their lives. At that time, having a slave was legal. It was allowed by the law. So he started to work with a young man who was in his church called William Wilberforce to try and get the law changed so that people couldn't be just bought and sold as slaves anymore. William was a very good speaker and a member of Parliament, and he gave a very famous speech. And in the end, the law in this country was changed and slavery was outlawed. Around this time, John, whose surname was Newton, John Newton, wrote a song. He called it Amazing Grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. I'm sure you know it. It's probably one of the most famous Christian songs of all, and people of every colour sing it all round the world. It's amazing to think what God can do with one person whose heart changes. John Newton was a really wicked man who did wicked things, but God changed his heart and he ended up being a good man who did really good things. It makes you wonder, what would God do with your life if you gave your life to God? You don't have to have done really bad things. Why don't you give your life to him now and ask, what can you do for him, and what will he do through you?